Okay, at this point, I would like to introduce Sam Miller. He's an associate teaching professor at the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. Sam teaches courses in strategic foresight, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and has previously served as vice president of strategy for a leading environmental consulting firm. He has been recognized as one of the top 100 entrepreneurship professors worldwide and was named by Business Week as one of the 21 people who will change business. I'd like you to welcome Sam Miller.
Okay, thank you, Ray. I can't stand behind a podium, so I'm going to be out in front, although I do need the clicker, which is behind the podium. Here we go. Okay, yeah, so I'm in the business school. I teach innovation, strategy, entrepreneurship, that sort of thing, but I have a background in ecological science. I was a strategy guy for a Midwestern ecological company by the name of JF New. They've got offices in Ohio, and they were acquired by Cardno back when I was with them. And so I've known Bill, Dr. Mitch, for about, 10, 12 years or so, and he brought this idea to me when he was the WETLACULTURE idea, and said, there's two challenges we face. There's a scientific challenge, right, that we heard a lot about, the questions about the hydrology and the soil science and the ecoregions and the crop selection and that sort of thing. How do we set these things up so they can absorb the pulses that are coming with these storm events and that sort of thing? And that was one challenge. But the other question is economic, right? And we heard in the morning session, hey, we've got all of this money, but it's scarce, and there was the 90% line, which was sort of a tongue-in-cheek, but we've got these scarce resources, and how can we spend those resources to achieve the ecological goals that we're aiming for? And so I believe it was over a beer, as we were talking, that the question that we came up with was, how do we design an economic model to go alongside the scientific model, which is being proven 1 square meter at a time in the mesocosmos, but how do we design an economic model that overcomes the agriculture resistance to say, you can't force me to retire my land, take it out of production, because that's how I feed my kids, right? That's how I pay my bills. But what if we envisioned it in a way that had farmers standing in line, getting on a waiting list to put their land into this program because it was as profitable or maybe more profitable because of the value it was providing, right? And so Bill said, okay, why don't you just take a blank sheet of paper and see what you can come up with, right? But it's a powerful question. And so I also recognize that I'm the guy standing between you guys and lunch. And so we're gonna go kind of quickly here. But let me explain the idea we're working on, right? And it goes along with proving out the science. But how do we take an entrepreneurial approach to developing a business model that has farmers standing in line to say, I want my land to be considered for that because it's a good business proposition, right? So one of the things we have to estimate here is what's the economic value in play, right? Because let's face it, just about all of these costs, all of the impacts are externalized, right? It's not priced into our farming model. It's not priced into our food production or the economics of the way we buy, consume, and use the agricultural products that are causing this, right? These externalized impacts are being felt by the tourism industry, the fisheries, right? The water utilities. We heard about the issues with the Toledo intake, right? Diminished property values and therefore property taxes on those property values, and then the healthcare costs, right? Bill's remark about the boat captains that run the fishing fleets for months afterwards We're suffering respiratory issues and that sort of thing, right? And so what about lost productivity, and what about the expense at the healthcare level and all of those sorts of things? What's the value of that? And right now the answer is we don't know very well, right? But if you look around, you can find some people that are starting to estimate it, right? And so there was a study done in 2009 across the U.S., freshwater systems in the U.S., that estimated it at as much as $5 billion in impacts, economic impacts from algae blooms affecting water quality across the U.S. $5 billion every year, right? I found a letter that was written a couple of years back by 2 Ohio representatives and 51 other members of Congress, written to the director of the Office of Management and Budget, that basically suggested toxic algae blooms are creating an impact of several $billion per year in economic costs, okay? And then there was a recent study, 2009. Now, this was based on a Canadian economy on Lake Erie, but it estimated over $200 million per year, $100 million of that in tourism on the Canadian side of the lake, right? So I think it's fair to say that the economic costs are significant. They're externalized, they're hard to measure, but they're real and they're significant. So for discussion purposes for today, let's just put in play that it's costing the Ohio economy in tourism, in utility costs, in health costs, in property values, et cetera, $100 million a year. Let's just use that as a benchmark to keep the dialogue going. And if we could achieve the guarantee that Bill's talking about, that this problem would go away, that we could call those avoided costs, costs that would not be borne by resorts, by marinas, by property owners, et cetera, to the tune of $100 million. So let's just put that in play. I don't have great evidence that that's what the number is, but let's just use it, okay? Another question to keep in mind is, well, are we getting out in front of this thing? Is that going down, or is it, where are we relative to the trajectory? I found this report by the World Resources Institute at the end of last year. So it's a recent report, and they're talking about the challenge of feeding the planet, a hungry planet, and just a couple of high-level points jumped off of that. That number one, the amount of food we create, we produce, and the amount of food that we need, there's a gap, and that gap is increasing. There are more hungry people, more people that want their diet to include protein, which a lot of times is filled with meat, right? In a planet that's getting more crowded and more prosperous, that gap in food production, in land availability, in nutrient density, all of those sorts of things, the gap is increasing, and we need to innovate to close that gap. And that number two, the way we're going to do that is through this process of intensification, right? Intensified land usage, intensified irrigation, intensified nutrients, intensified use of genetics, all of those sorts of things, which is to say that the downstream impacts that we're trying to estimate a value on are likely to increase if, in fact, we are going to close that gap, right? And so, and World Resources Institute is active in this space, so I trust them as a resource, right? So back to the business model, the blank sheet of paper. The question is, can we create something that's a feasible business model, an exchange of value that would work? And so the essential assumption here is that the avoided costs would be greater than the costs it takes to avoid them, okay? The opportunity cost for the farmers. Farmers squeeze every square inch of productive value out of their land because they need to, right? It's a tough business, and they're hardworking, and if you take that land out of production, somehow there needs to be a value proposition that says it's good economically for them. right? The restoration costs, we're talking about taking land that is currently functioning in one purpose and redeploying it for something else. And so we have to change the hydrology. We have to perhaps plant native wetland plants and all of those sorts of things. There are costs to do the conversion, right? And then for a program like this, there will be some sort of administrative measurement verification costs that have to go along. And if we can come up with an estimate or a model where those costs are lower than the opportunity or the avoided costs, then it makes sense, right? And I think I'm going to show a potential idea here where the value trade-off is going to be favorable, right? So then the question is, how do you structure the exchange? And this is where it gets interesting. So there is an emerging phenomenon out there known as environmental impact bonds. And I'm going to give you I'm going to fly by some examples here, and I encourage you to go and search them and understand these things, because there's a few examples and they're experimental, but boy, they could be a really, really big idea. And so here's the concept, right? Number one, private investment dollars fund the heavy lift on the front end, right? And that those investment dollars expect a market rate of return. It's not government subsidies or other sorts of endowment money or something. It's invested money coming from traditional investors that are seeking a market rate of return, that there's an incentive for these wetlands to work, right? That the outcomes that we seek are incentivized, that you earn a higher return if indeed your wetlands sequester the nutrients and clean the water the way that the contract was designed to do. You have to decide in advance, what are you going to measure, and what that measure is going to be used to trigger the payment for success, right? So will you be measuring the number of algae blooms on Lake Erie, or will you be measuring the water nutrient content at the back end of the wetland, or will you be measuring the biodiversity on the wetland, or the soil content and nutrient density? And you need to figure that out and write it into the contract, okay, and then monitor it. And then I put this in. There's also some interesting, so this is investment money being used to serve social purposes in ways that we're not traditionally doing. But there's also examples in what they call social impact bonds, where they use this sort of thing, private invested capital, to help prisoners recently released get back on track and stay out of prison. And if we can do that, the savings, the avoided costs are ginormous. And so you invest the money to provide them education, training, support services to keep them off of drugs and out of crime, and et cetera. And if it works, and in Europe and in New York, they had a program in place right now that's working. Now, is it perfect? No, they're learning along the way. Another one where they had children that were ending up in the foster care situation and that sort of thing, very expensive. And it turns out that an awful lot of them are coming from homes where the parents are addicted. And so the cure isn't to try to find more foster parents or something. It's to help the addicted parents beat the addiction. Same thing. Invest the money, provide social services to help reduce addiction, which keeps the kids out of foster care. So look those examples up. There's more, but this is something that's it's on the horizon, and I think we're going to see more of it, right? Underlying principle here is that I am not going to provide some sort of definitive answer, roadmap, structure. This is a conversation starter. I'm not trying to provide the answer. I'm trying to help us figure out what questions to ask. Okay, so keep that in mind and be gentle on your questions to me, because a lot of this stuff, the assumptions are a little flimsy, right? And but we're starting a conversation. So, two examples. Let me give you an example Washington, D.C. has a problem with, probably most of you in this room understand what CSOs are, right? Combined sewer overflow events, where you have stormwater and sewage water going down the same pipe, and when we get that 3 inches per hour sort of event, it overwhelms the system, and the utility has no choice but to just flush the untreated water, mostly stormwater, but it contains untreated sewage, into the public waterways, and it's nasty, right? Nobody wants that going on at all. And so one thing you can do is you can use concrete and pipe and storage tanks and that sort of thing, very expensive, or you can create green infrastructure. And these guys did that in D.C., where they had huge problems with CSOs, and so look at who's in play, right? So you've got an environmental nonprofit, boots on the ground sort of thing. You've got a foundation, an organization with money they're looking to put in play to do good, but they want to move beyond just giving money and then walking away and hoping it does good, right? So they're investing it with a return on investment expectation. And you got Wall Street. Goldman Sachs says we're in. Right? And $25 million for the first one. This is the first payment for success environmental project anywhere, right? And it launched in 2017, and it's up and running. And I mean, if you convince Goldman Sachs to put money into something, there's an argument there, right? And here's another one, right? Wildfires out west, huge challenge, huge problem. And super expensive after the fire starts, right? Once the fire starts, fire suppression, property damage, injuries, deaths, lawsuits, all of that sort of stuff, super expensive. If we can prevent those fires, oh my goodness, right? And so here's another environmental impact bond, a conservation group and an investment group, and they basically said, the underlying problem is that the Forest Service doesn't have the money to maintain the forest, to trim the undergrowth. They don't have enough money. And so because they don't do it year after year after year, one spark, one bolt of lightning, and it's a tinderbox, right? If we had the money, we could do the maintenance, and the fires would be smaller and much more manageable. Well, how about if we gave you that money, right? Put the money to work, maintaining the forests, not fighting fires, not providing more fireproof buildings. Maintain the forest, and then use the savings to pay a return on that investment, right? And who's paying for that? We got the utility companies, right? How'd you like to be PG&E right now? Did they go bankrupt? I think they had to file bankruptcy because of because their overhead towers sparked the fires. Right, and the Forest Service and the property owners and others, the insurance companies, are funding this, saying the avoided costs are so much higher than the cost to avoid them that there's a return on investment here. So look at these examples, and there's more coming online. One in Atlanta and others. Right, so if we can understand that the avoided cost number is about $100 million. Let's try to understand what the cost to avoid them would be. And so looking at opportunity costs, I'm going to go through this really quickly here. This is from Ohio State, right, that economics of corn farming at 2 bushels per acre and $4 per bushel, you get about $800 per acre of revenue. Here are your costs, right? So about $450 per cost. So you can earn about $350 per acre to produce corn, okay? If you look at it and you say, well, if I was going to take production out of active ag production, that acreage, I would probably use my less productive. So let's also recognize an estimate of 75% of that, say $260 or so for the land that's probably a little too wet, and isn't the most productive. Those are the ones that the farmers would probably say, I'd like to retire those, right? And then recognize here $132 per acre. That's what the Ohio State says farmers on average are using in terms of the economic cost of nutrients. Okay, remember that number. We're going to come back to it. It's part of the WETLACULTURE model. So $260 for less productive land, $346 for the most productive land, and $130 or so in annual nutrient costs per acre, right? So those are the opportunity costs in play. The restoration costs, again, super quickly, this is Bill Mitch's graph here, that we're going to estimate. Now, of course, any of you that have been in the wetland restoration business recognize that the cost per acre to do a really big wetland is a lot lower than the cost per acre to do a small wetland. And so we looked at a range of them, and it seemed like 500 acres was, if we're going to do this thing at scale, then let's recognize at scale what it is. So it's about $2 million to do a 500-acre wetland, recognizing that there are programs in place to reimburse about 3/4 of those costs, that the out-of-pocket costs of whoever's going to be funding that is about $500,000 out of pocket, which works out to be about $1,000 out of pocket per acre for a 500-acre site. So keep that number in mind. Okay? Now, part of this model is a payment for ecosystem services model, right? We all understand ecosystem services. What we don't understand is the economics of how much are they worth. This model is based on a payment for ecosystem services. So a couple of things that are in mind. I know phosphorus is like the big dog in this race, but we are assuming that we can stack nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon offsets, carbon credits, to the tune of using the sequestration rates of 2 grams per square meter per year and 40 grams per square meter per year. And market prices, if you want to talk offline where those prices came from, mostly from markets that are in existence and other think tanks and experts like World Resources Institute with programs in the Mississippi Basin and in Ohio and other places, that we can get about $770 per acre per year in ecosystem services value if we can stack them, and that's an assumption. Right now you can't stack them. Also recognize that in these market-based things, there's an assumption that there's a risk factor, and so what they use is a thing they call the trading ratio. And so in my estimates, I assumed a 2-to-1 trading ratio, which is to say that you only get half of the credit that you're really aiming for as a baseline. And again, you can dig into the gears behind that if you like, but that if indeed these wetlands perform at a higher rate, we think we can improve that to 1.5 to 1, okay, and capture that value in the contract. So that brings it down to about $386. There's CRP credits right now that's Conservation Reserve Program credits at about $70 per acre, so those are in play, which gets us at a trading ratio of 2-to-1 to about $450 per acre per year in ecosystem services payments, if we can create a market for those. Keep that number in mind. Okay. So could we structure this thing to achieve 100,000 acres, right, which is the number that Bill suggested we might need, right? 100,000 acres at $1,000 per acre, we need $100 million. $100 million. And so what we would do is we'd set it up to do 10% of it every year for 10 years, and then we load the deck. We're cycling it through, right? So $10 million every year in a bond that would pay 2%, which is about what a municipal bond pays, with the upside of up to 5% if the wetlands perform. So there's incentive built in for the investors, okay? Every year we build another 10,000 acres of wetland, and the wetlands are in WETLACULTURE for 10 years, and then guess what? They're turned back into ag land, okay? So here's the flow, and Bill showed an older version. This is updated a little bit. But it's $4,000 per acre, right? NRCS and other government programs are in place to fund 3/4 of that, right? So $3,000 an acre comes from the government programs. The bond puts in $1,000 an acre. So you've got the cost of restoration covered if you can have those two flows, right? Then the payment for ecosystem services every year, measurement, verified, documented, and then reimbursed $450 per acre per year in carbon and phosphorus and nitrogen credits. Okay, where does that money go then? Well, $250 goes to the farmer. If you remember, that's about what their marginal farmland was throwing off. So they're happy, right? 2% goes back to pay the juice on the bond, okay? $150 goes into a replenishment fund because we have to pay that bond back. And let me tell you what I'm thinking here, okay? So $100 goes over 10 years, goes back to pay that $1,000 per acre so that the bond at the end of 10 years, that $10 million is paid back, okay? But we've got $50 left over, right? That what we can do is cycle this through back to help these guys replenish that fund, right? Remember that early this morning, it's like, but we're going to run out of money. They're going to spend that money. We need more money. And where's my share of the money, right? That if we give $500 back to NRCS to replenish that fund, then it starts to no longer be a net loss for the government and stakeholders. And bear in mind that you have what this program does not require is payment of rent on the acreage, which a lot of those programs include. And this is good acreage, $200, $250 per acre. That if you had $250 per acre per year, that you're basically saving them $3,000. That once we get this thing loaded up, it's funded in perpetuity. Okay. And then $30 or so to pay to manage to do the verification and the contract management and that sort of thing. Now, if we can get that 1.5 to 1 trading ratio, that using science, using Bing's numbers to say, hold it, the higher end goal is this, and if we can achieve that, another $130 per acre, right? That pays the farmer $80 to take care of that wetland, to maintain it, to do the things that make it successful. And if you do that, you just turn that marginal acre of farmland into the economic value of their most productive. It's a positive economic equation for these guys, right? You pay an extra 3% so the investors are interested in helping pick the right locations and do the things that make sure that it works. Put an extra $20 into the fund management to do some things like insure. Like, well, what do you do if there's a really bad drought or something and the hydrology fails and those sorts of things? You got a little bit of a slush fund. And remember the $130? Well, if that farmland is paying $260 per year, and you can, after you put it back into agriculture, save them $130 because they're not going to need to apply the nutrients, then you just gave them a 50% improvement on the economics of their traditional farmland. There is the underlying assumptions of the business model to start the conversation. Okay? What are the costs? Well, $450 minus the $70 that comes out of the CRP plus the $130 makes it about $500 an acre or about $50 million a year on top of the restoration costs. Now, if you remember, the avoided costs were $100 million. So this is half as expensive if we can make it work. Right? That I can save you $100, but it's going to cost you $50. Is that a good trade-off? Yes. Who's going to pay for it? Well, there's a couple of different ways you can look at it. Again, this is broad stroke, but you could do the polluter pays model, right? That the farmers are doing this. They're intensifying. They're doing it legally. They're doing it within the bounds of being good citizens. But it's their phosphorus, right? So in Ohio, it's a $9.5 billion thing. If you put a 0.5% levy, you can raise $50 million to use to fund the PES, right? Or you could use beneficiary pays, right? Who's eating those costs? It's the tourism guys and the fisheries guys and the municipalities guys. And so if you look at $43 billion, you put a 0.1% levy on tourism. You could raise $50 million a year and fund the PES, right? And so you've got $50 million a year for 10 years is $500 million. You got $4,000 an acre for 100,000 acres is close to $500 million. It's $1 billion project, right? So possible next steps, we need to keep working to understand the economics of this, right? Is it really a $100 million problem? Gaining stakeholder engagement. You've got a lot of people that we're assuming would want to sit at this table. But we haven't really had the open dialogue. We need to do that, right? Proof of concept, right? Proving the science out, right? And taking it from 1 square meter times 27 units to a 500-acre sort of thing using research funding or NSF or somebody. And then engage with the various funding sources, foundations, local organizations, governments, business, right, et cetera, and Wall Street, and see what their point of view is. And so we're not there yet, but it's a really intriguing idea, and it absolutely blows up all of the underlying assumptions of how we solve this problem now, which is not based on farmers standing in line to join, but farmers reluctantly, you're shaking your head, reluctantly, fighting to preserve as much of their own land as they can, because guess that's what they do, they farm. So that's what I have. I think we are heading for lunch. What's our strategy here, Ray? Can we do questions now, or want to save it for the afternoon session?
So my question is, how does the free or nearly free manure from operators anxious to get rid of this affect the markets?
Yeah, it's not only is it free, but if they don't get rid of it, then they have a secondary problem of what are they going to do? And that's a huge question, right? The numbers that I got, I think, were inclusive of that, which includes maybe the labor and equipment to spread it. There's a lot of interest in biodigesters and other sorts of things that could create a secondary use for that manure. Yeah, we've got the manure. We have to do something with the manure. Spreading it on the fields seems like a... Yeah. Yeah, I think we would need to explore other options, like creating methane with a biodigester and then using the other byproducts for something other than nutrients, right? That you take the... but it's certainly part of the ecosystem that we need to explore here. Sir?
I had 2 questions about what you had talked about. One was that you assumed that the stacking was permissible. How does this hold up if it's not? And who holds the market? Like, where is the clearing for this done?
Right now, so 2 questions. Stacking is assumed because the people that make the decisions about stacking are also the people that are facing the externalized outrage of all of this. That my expectation is that if there was a feasible science-based, economics-based alternative that said if we could do these things and stack them, the challenge is additionality, right? There's a risk that you could sell the same credits over and over for different uses, right? That you couldn't take. We had heard about wetland banking this morning. You couldn't take mitigation credits and then also resell them here. But if you could define the boundaries, I think the stakeholders on the public sector side would have a real incentive to be open-minded about this. But right now it is not, right? And the second question was, so this is not as much of a market economy as I would have liked. And the challenge here is it goes to the point source versus non-point source issue that just about all of the nutrient trading that you see is point source people, right? That you got a pipe coming out of a water treatment plant, and they're being told you got to reduce by this much. If you can reduce by more, you can sell those credits, and if you're having trouble, you got to go buy some credits, and then you let the market go. Non-point source, I'm having trouble coming up with a open market free exchange sort of thing. So these things look a little bit more like a tax, which I think it's better if we could have the market float. I haven't been able to come up with ideas on that. But so you look at it and you say, okay, tourism industry, how'd you like to make this thing go away for 0.1%? You can pass it on. Staying here, would I have paid an extra $1 a night to have the beach clean? I probably would, right? So I guess that's the voice of the market, but it's a flaw that goes back to the point source versus non-point source. I would make the point that the mesocosms, as they're defined in the lab, are point source kind of thing, but the way this thing is implemented is hundreds of acres of continuous wetland, non-point source solution, and somebody smarter than me needs to help me figure that one out. It's a great observation, and thank you for pointing that out. One more question here.
In Florida, it's okay to tax tourists. That's okay.
Yeah.
We're good with that.
Yeah, and here's the thing: if the value that you're getting for having to pay a little more for a rental car or a hotel room or whatever for a clean beach versus getting there and going, oh, this sucks. This beach used to be so nice, and look at it. If the value is there, then the market probably steps up. So, okay, well, I appreciate your time, and I think we'll certainly have more time this afternoon to sort of weave a lot of these things together, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you.